Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today on the very timely topic of seeing through the fog in Russia and Ukraine. This is really very much a webinar at the intersection of two of our webinar series. We have officially advertised for it as part of our Towards Life 3.0 series, but it could just as well be in our Human Rights in Hard Places series. So just a couple of words on both of these series. By the way, my name is Mathias Risse. I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and we are organizing both of these series. So the Towards Life 3.0 series is dedicated to issues, ethical human rights related issues that arise in the domain of technological innovation, that arise around the new technological possibilities that we have these days. We have named it Toward Life 3.0, taking the title, drawing on the title of Max Tegmark's wonderful book, Life 3.0. That is basically pointing towards a possibility that might eventually arise, namely that we have an intelligence explosion, so one extreme way in which technological innovation could change the world, which by itself, of course, would raise a whole range of ethics and human rights related issues. But many human rights and ethics issues arise about technological innovation already as it is. So we are in that series, we are covering the whole range of those. And then the other series, Human Rights in Hard Places, in a way the title says it all. So this is a series dedicated to locations in which human rights are especially under attack, and so now you can see why a topic that involves technological issues and technological connections as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned is really very much at the intersection of both of these series. I am absolutely thrilled to have with us today Eric Tola, who works for one of the most fascinating organizations in the human rights world broadly conceived, namely Bellingcat. Bellingcat is an organization that is dedicated to using largely really open source materials in order to track human rights offenders, to track oppressive state functions, to track abuse of power. They became quite famous, in particular, for their work around the shooting down of Malaysian airliner Flight 17. And what they do is basically they use their largely openly available material and paste it together in often incredibly painstaking work to see what has been what the background to certain events is. And for example, in the case of the Malaysian airliner, they took advantage of a particular habit that a lot of people have in Eastern Europe, namely they drive around and they shoot videos of what they're doing with their dashboard camera. They put it up, and with sufficiently much time and attention to detail, you can figure out a lot of things by just kind of seeing by following what different people saw by driving around in these ways. So that's the kind of work that they do. Fascinating book to read on that. We Are Bellingcat by the founding spirit, Elliot Higgins. So I'd all encourage you to read this maybe as a follow-up to this. They're called Bellingcat, by the way. It's also quite intriguing by itself. So there's the cat that threatens the mice, and what do the mice do in order to protect themselves against the cat? Well, they put a bell on the cat, right? So what the cat does, what the cat in this case, the offender, right? What the offender does needs to be, we need to know about it, right? We need to see it coming, and we need to do the background work. So we need to bell the cat. So this is what Bellingcat does. Eric Tola leads the research and training activities for Bellingcat on Eastern Europe. So he is one of their leading experts, specifically also on what's happening in Ukraine. And he has also himself been involved in the ongoing investigations into the downing of MH17, also in the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, and the conflict in the Donbass up to the invasion of Ukraine. So he is incredibly well versed in all events that are unfolding there right now. And so we're eager to hear now from Eric. So again, the topic is seeing through the fog in Russia and Ukraine. Eric will talk for about 25 minutes, and after that we're going to have our usual Q&A. So I encourage everybody in the audience then also to put your questions in the YouTube chat. And we will be screening that. We will have some Sushma Raman, the executive director of the Carr Center, who will be joining us then later, and I will have some questions of our own, but we'll be very much screening the questions also that you put in the chat. And now, without further ado, Eric, over to you. Welcome. You are mute still. Sorry, I muted you earlier.
Sorry about that problem. Thank you for that. And yeah, it's maybe a little bit overhyped on my part, but I'll take it either way. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so happy to have, glad that you had me on today, and thanks for the invitation. I'm gonna be talking to you guys for the next 25 minutes or so, a little bit about how you kind of uncover the fog, as I say, or see through the fog in Russia and Ukraine in particular. And with the war that's going on now, this is more important than ever, and how we understand how Russia and its security services and its military works, and also Ukraine as well. I have a little bit of talk about Ukraine, depending on how fast I get through my slides today. But this isn't just Russia, it's Ukraine as well. But Russia is the one that does the most, let's just say, interesting and explicitly flagrant violations of the international order and human rights and all that stuff. So they're a little bit easier to pick on just because it's a little bit low-hanging fruit. But you see some of this with other countries as well. And plus, I focus on Russia. I studied Russian literature in grad school once upon a time. It's my area of focus, so that's what I work on. So you may have heard about all sorts of different stories about apparent possible activities of Russian military and security services over the last few years in Europe, in Russia proper, and in their near abroad as well. So there was an assassination, for example, in broad daylight. A Chechen man was shot in central Berlin. The guy was driving this kind of like electric scooter thing and made a getaway, but he got caught. The very famous now poisoning of former spy Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in the UK, along with his daughter, and the unfortunate accidental death of a local woman who found kind of some leftover poison. The arms depot explosion in Czechia. Also, there were similar explosions in Bulgaria as well that happened back in 2014. And most famously of all, probably the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the leading opposition figure in Russia, who's in jail right now, who was poisoned and thankfully barely survived the poisoning before going to Berlin, recovering, and then returning back only to be jailed. And the Ukraine example I mentioned earlier, the so-called Wagner Gate, which was the arrest of 33 Wagner fighters who were in Belarus at the time. These were all or almost all Russian. Like there was one dual U.S. Russian Ukrainian citizen, but the rest were Russians. And right before the elections in Minsk. And this turns out actually was all a very elaborate Ukrainian operation to get to have this happen. Well, it didn't go the way it planned, but the reason why they were there is because of Ukraine operations. So all of these stories I've showed you have been solved by us, and some other people have done some more work on them as well. But the reason why these crimes are being able to be solved, these are kind of like very, it's like you're watching The Americans, right? These spy operations with FSB and GRU officers. So GRU is Russian military intelligence. FSB is kind of internal security and intelligence in Russia. And the reasons why we're able to solve these crimes, these assassination attempts and successes, these explosions of arms depots, these hacking attempts, all this other stuff, is just because of Russian data and how Russian data works and how it flows out and is able to be retrieved by people like me. I'm sitting here in Kansas in the US, and I could retrieve a lot of this data that is coming out of Russia. And Russian personal data is very widely available for basically anyone with the know-how and an internet connection, and maybe maybe $50 in Bitcoin to transfer over to. The amount of information here, it's staggering. It's collected for a lot of different reasons, and this is stuff that to some degree exists in the U.S. and other Western countries. You can get some of this information if you know where to look. Most notably, you can get some of this through advertising data. You can buy like geolocation data for people who use certain apps on certain phones. You can kind of get around for this, but it's much more oblique and a little bit harder to get to. For the Russia, where it's like an Amazon, you like add someone's phone number to your cart, you check out, and for $30 you get their phone records for 6 months. It's on a different level entirely. And so you have this gigantic collection of personal data that is being collected often by the government. These are the Yarovaya laws back in 2016 that were passed, mandated Russian telecom companies and other places to maintain and retain customer data for Russian citizens. And these Russian citizens aren't just, the reasons why these are passed were to strengthen security services so they can have increased surveillance regimes and so on, like the Patriot Act, right, in the US after 9/11. But it's a double-edged sword because not only are the security services able to use this, but because Russia is Russia, this data is being sold in the black market as well. And so what we and other people have done is get some of that data from the black market and to retrieve the data from security service officers. So the idea behind this is FSB officers can spy on people based on this maintained telecom data, so telephone records, things like that. But it works the other way too, to where people can buy through the black market the personal telecom data of these same FSB officers who are snooping on other people. So that's kind of how this cycle works. And not only is this done through this kind of snooping, which isn't just high level stuff. You hear stories about wives who buy the telecom data, cell phone records of their husbands to see if they're cheating on them, right? You can, like I said, this is like you can go and add it to your card and check out and have someone send it to you. It's not super complicated. It's not just that, but a lot of major Russian platforms and sites are leaking constantly. You may have heard about the Yandex food leak. This is like the Grubhub or Uber Eats or DoorDash of Russia, basically, had a huge leak about a week ago. And a lot of this stuff is now very useful. I've been running some of this data. We have lots of phone numbers, email addresses, and addresses linked to different officers. And we can see that these people have been getting food delivered to their houses or to their workplaces. And they'll leave little notes on there of like, go and call this number when you arrive at the gate or the checkpoint, and I'll go and pick it up for you, right? So now we know these people's phone numbers and how they operate and all that stuff. And a lot of other platforms like Mail.ru and Kontaktya are leaking constantly, much more often than the Western equivalents of like Gmail and Facebook. So because of all these different data leaks, here's some examples of these. You're able to collect this information, purchase it, collect it, download it, and cross-reference it to build a picture of what's going on in Russia. These are things that you can't really do with CIA officers or MI6 officers or Mossad officers the same way we can with FSB and GRU, just because the way the data works and operates in Russia. To see through the fog, as the title of the talk says. These are a few examples of this. And not just this, but also there's a powerful facial recognition kind of regime in Russia. In the US and Western Europe, we have things like Clearview AI, which are mostly used by police departments and governments in the US and elsewhere. Most famously, they're offering their services to the Ukrainian government as well to identify soldiers who have been killed. But most of their clients are like cops in the US who identify suspects, and through maybe successfully or maybe not, there's a lot of ethical questions about this. They try to find the people through surveillance footage, run their faces through Clearview AI, and try to find their Facebook page. That's basically how it works. But in Russia, it's much, much more expansive. There are multiple platforms that take Russian social media, scrape all of Russian social media platforms like Kontaktya, index them, run machine learning algorithms to do facial recognition, and then you can find them. This is an example here. This is the crash wreckage of MH17 that was shot down back in July 2014. And some of the guys and yahoos and one gal who were kind of posing with it, and they were looting it, they were stealing stuff, they're doing all sorts of horrible stuff. Run this guy's face through one of these facial recognition platforms. This one's called FineClone, and you can find his profile right away. It takes 3 seconds. You can find his profile. This is him. His name is a guy named Taras. And so these are things that don't really exist in the US. There are some facial recognition platforms you could run. And I say the US, I also mean, the UK, Netherlands, Germany, so on. These exist in much smaller form, but you usually have to be a cop with institutional budgets to afford these things. FineClone, 7-day free trial, and it's like, I don't know, it's like $3 a month after that. It's dirt cheap. And this is something you can do in Russia and Ukraine because these platforms are leaking constantly. You have this possibility that does not exist elsewhere. So let me give you an example of this in motion with the case of Navalny. So I'm going to kind of how all these things kind of coalesce into one big kind of workflow, I guess you could say. So for those who aren't familiar with the case of Navalny, I'll give you a 30-second, maybe 45-second rundown of what happened with him. So this is about a year ago or so. He well, 2 years, I guess. It's 2022 already. Navalny, who is the leading opposition figure in Russia, him and his organization, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, they were going to do some work off in Siberia. So they were going to Novosibirsk, Tomsk, and Tomsk to film, to research, do some work. So on the 14th, he went from Moscow to Novosibirsk, which is off in Siberia. And from there, he was there for 3 days. And 3 days later, him and his team, they got in a car and they drove to Tomsk, which is like a 4 or 5 hour drive, which in Siberia is like, the next town over. It's pretty quick. And then they were there for a couple of days. And then on the evening of August 19th, Navalny was poisoned with Novichok, which is a Soviet era poison. The next morning, so like 6 a.m. the next morning, he got onto a flight to go back home from Tomsk back to Moscow. While he was in the air, he got incredibly sick. There's videos of this, him screaming, he was dying, he felt horrible. They rerouted the plane and they landed at Omsk, which is not Tomsk, but Omsk. Tomsk is very nice. Omsk is not very nice, as their reputations go. And he was hospitalized there. And thankfully, when he was on the runway, a medic gave him an antidote right away. They suspected poisoning right away. And that medic on the runway saved his life. He would have died otherwise if that medic hadn't done that. He was there for a couple of days, and eventually he left to Berlin, where he recovered. A year or so later, he went back to Russia, and he's in jail now. So the timeline very quickly, 14th from Moscow to Novosibirsk. They drove to Tomsk from there. And on their way back to Moscow, they rerouted to Omsk, and that's where he was in hospital before he eventually went to Berlin. That's the quick rundown. So we want to know, okay, he was poisoned, clearly. So how can we use all these things I'm talking about, all this data culture, this data leakage, to find out who are his poisoners? All we know is he was poisoned, and we know his trip, itinerary. That's all we knew at the time. We have 2 different research threads that use 2 different kind of trajectories to find out who the poisoners are using all this leaky data. The first is we've already done a lot of work investigating poisons from the Russian security services, specifically with the Skripal poisonings back in 2018, which was done by the Russian military intelligence, or GRU. So we already know who the scientists were who developed and used Novichok. So if Novichok was used with Navalny, which, spoiler alert, it was, like it was with Skripal, there's a very good chance that the same scientists who work on these, the chemical weapon experts, consulted with the poisoners for Navalny, the same as they did with Skripal, because the GRU, the people who, the famous Chupiga and Mishkin, the guy who did the famous interview with RT and talked about how much they love the Salisbury Cathedral, they actually were talking to and meeting with these scientists. So it was very direct. So we figured that the poisoners in Navalny also probably talked to these same scientists. So we had their phone records because we just buy them on the black market. So we could study those phone records and see who was talking to whom around the time of the poisoning and the lead up, and then investigate those people and those phone numbers. Okay. The second thread is looking at the actual flights and travel records themselves, because you can buy flight manifests and travel records too. So what you can do here is look at the travel itineraries of other people who were flying on the same itinerary as Navalny. Because this is in the height of COVID. This is August 2020, when COVID was rampaging everything back then. And this is when people weren't traveling a whole lot. So there were a lot fewer people on planes, which means you can study each passenger a lot more intently than before, because you have half or 1/3 the amount of passengers. So we would try to see who had tickets with that exact same itinerary, which is an unusual itinerary. He didn't go round trip Moscow, Novosibirsk, Novosibirsk, Moscow. He went Moscow, Novosibirsk, drove to Tomsk, and Tomsk, Moscow. So can we find anyone except for Navalny who booked a ticket from Moscow to Novosibirsk and then return trip Tomsk to Moscow, which is an unusual itinerary because not a lot of people are doing that road trip between Novosibirsk and Tomsk. So anyone else has the exact same itinerary as him, plus minus 1 day, is probably the poisoner or linked to him, or some cosmic coincidence. Okay, those are our 2 threads for research. Back to the first one, the phone run. So we looked at the phone numbers of these people, these scientists who were involved in the chemical weapon experts and scientists. Oops, sorry, this goes a little bit early. Yep, sorry, I popped this up a tiny bit early here. My little box is covering up the personal data. But this is an example of the phone records that we got from some of the scientists who were involved in the previously the poisoning of Skripal and now of Navalny. And we looked at the spikes of calls that they had leading up to and after the poisoning. And we found some very suspicious phone numbers, which we'll be talking about soon. So you run all these phone numbers through different online services. You can search these phone numbers through contact book apps like Truecaller and GetContact. You can run them through leaked VK databases, because VK, which is it's the Russian Facebook basically. Everyone's account is linked to a phone number, so you can see phone number to name very easily. And you can check car registration. If they own a car in Moscow, you register your car to your phone number and your passport number, which is kind of a weird way that it operates in Russia compared to the US and elsewhere. So we can find people's names and addresses from there. And another little, feature, or I don't know if it's a bug or a feature of the system of Russia, is people who work in security services and military will often register their vehicles to their workplace. So if you work for the FSB or the GRU, if you're a spy, you register your car not to your home address, but to your work address. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Imagine you're drunk driving or you're speeding, someone pulls you over, the cop sees your registration is the headquarters of the FSB, Lubyanka, or the headquarters of GRU. Is that cop going to give you a ticket or just let you go? Obviously, they're not going to give you a ticket. They're going to recognize the address and let you go on your way. And so because of that, for example, at the FSB's Special Operations Center, there's about 200 people who register their vehicles that one building alone. And no one lives there. It's just people all register their vehicles there for the petty corruption factor. So these phone numbers are not just data points. These phone numbers all lead to identities of all the people we're interested in. And here's some of the sources I talked about here. And also things like that Yandex food leak, which we, at the time, obviously that leak did not happen, but I reran some of these phone numbers through the Yandex food leak, which is like the DoorDash of Russia. And I found a few deliveries to people that we had identified. Anyway, so we ran all those phone numbers. We got some interesting names. We got the same thing here with the flights. We went through the flights and we found one person who had the exact same flight itinerary as Navalny, but plus minus 1 day. He arrived a day earlier and left a day later. There's a guy named Alexei Frolov. Now, this guy Frolov is interesting because he, as I'll talk about in a second, he's a ghost. It's as if he was born the day that he flew, which I'll talk about in a minute. But he had the exact same itinerary as Navalny, plus minus 1 day, which made him suspicious. And he had two co-travelers, because this is another feature, I guess you could say, or maybe bug of the GRU and FSB. These guys always, and they're usually all guys, they always book their tickets together. I kind of imagine them going and checking in their luggage together. It's kind of cute at the airport. But for some reason, like whoever like the secretary or travel agent is, who was booking all these like poisoning and hacking trips, they book their tickets as a joint operation. So imagine like you're booking a ticket for you or your kids, right? Let's say you're doing a family trip to Jamaica, whatever. And when you go and you buy your tickets, you don't go and buy tickets 3 times. You buy your tickets in one operation, then you can all sit together. Right? They do the same thing with the GRU and FSB. They should. I mean, I'm not going to give them advice, but if I were them, I'd buy tickets separately. But they buy them a joint operation to save 5 minutes of work. And so we see that this guy Frolov booked his ticket with a guy named Panyaev and a guy named Spiridonov. So they all booked their tickets together and they sat together kind of in one little line together. So this Frolov guy didn't really, and Frolov and Spiridonov both, they don't really exist. Like they had no taxpayer number, which is kind of like a social security number. They had no vehicle, no residence, no social media, no phone number, no address, nothing. They were ghosts. It's that they were born the day that they flew. So we looked into them a little bit more, but Panyaev, remember there's one guy who had the exact same itinerary, and then 2 people who didn't have the same itinerary, but were co-booked to travel back together. So Frolov, exact same itinerary. Spiridonov and Panyaev, not the exact same itinerary, but they were traveling together back with this Frolov guy. Panyaev was a real person. He had a real phone number. He had an address. He had a vehicle. He was a real guy. And if you look over here, he actually got his Yandex food order too. Now, so I know where he lives because he ordered some food. And I got his address too, because he's on there. We searched his phone number on contact book apps, which are apps where people, the idea behind this is when people call you, you can see who's calling you, and they get the information about who's calling you from the contact book names for people in other people's phone books. So if I install this app on my phone, it takes my contact book and the names I have for people in there, are uploaded to their database. And somebody has this guy in their phone as FSB Vladimir Alexandrovich Panyaev, which is not like 100% proof this guy's in the FSB, but it's, it's a pretty good lead. So we looked more into these people, and we looked at other trips that they took, because now clearly these people are kind of suspicious. This guy is marked as FSB, and also these other two people just as if they were invented the day before and they were following Navalny. And also, I should also tell you that Panyaev's phone number was in the logs for the chemical weapon expert. The chemical weapon guy talked to Panyaev before the poisoning. So that was pretty solid proof to us that he was involved. So we looked more into this Panyaev guy, who would talk to the scientist before the poisoning, and also flew with the same trip back with Navalny. Not the same one, but the same itinerary. And we found that he actually been trailing Navalny for a while. Him and Frolov, they had actually been trailing for a while. They went the exact same trip to Navalny to Kaliningrad back in 2020, to Chelyabinsk in 2017, and to Astrakhan in 2017. The thing about Astrakhan, though, is Navalny never made it because he got the Zalyonka in the eye right beforehand. So they were sitting in Astrakhan waiting for him, but he never showed up because he got Zalyonka the day before. So they had a fun fishing trip to Astrakhan instead. So we looked more into these people. So Panyaev was kind of the linchpin at this point, because we have his real identity. We know he's linked to the FSB. He talked to the chemical weapon experts, and he had trailed Navalny for years, literally for years. He was like his ghost. He was traveling along with him on different trips. And we noticed that one of his a different trip to Omsk back in 2017, we noticed that he had a co-traveler named Alexei Alexandrov. And this Alexandrov guy was very suspicious to us, because he registered his vehicle at one point to the next to the FSB Academy. So it's like a big dorm that's right next to the FSB Academy. So this is where, if you're going to the Academy, this is where you stay in the dorm. And also his personal data looked really familiar to this Frolov guy. So Frolov was a ghost who existed to fly and only to fly. He didn't have any phone number, address, nothing. He just flew, and that's all he ever did. And and Panyaev flew both with Frolov and Alexandrov. We looked into these two people. We noticed that they look pretty familiar. They're both Alexei. Their patronyms start with A, and their birthdays are the exact same, except Alexandrov is 1 year younger. So Frolov is 1 year older by the day than Alexandrov. And we also looked more in this Alexandrov guy. We realized that his wife's maiden name was Frolova. So this was our cue of like, oh wait, this is his secret identity. That actually Frolov and Alexandrov are the same person, because when he made his fake ID, we found this actually with other people too. He used his wife's maiden name for his fake identity's name. So of course, this then pings us like, oh wow, we should look into the wives' maiden names of other agents and look for first name plus other maiden name of wife with birthday 1 year off. And I'll give you a little spoiler for about 2 minutes from now. We found 2 or 3 other secret identities because they use this template over and over. So we look more into Alexandrov, which is the real identity of Frolov. And we found that Alexandrov, who, according to travel records, was still in Moscow. He was still in Moscow court. He didn't travel or anything. Frolov did. Alexandrov didn't. And we found out Alexandrov, he pinged a cell phone tower. He turned his cell phone on probably by accident. And when you turn your cell phone on, even if it's in airplane mode, there's like a single little like byte that escapes the cell phone, and it pinged the cell phone tower, which we found when we got his cell phone records. And it pinged the cell phone tower near the hotel where Navalny was staying in Novosibirsk. So this Alexandrov guy, who was actually Frolov, he turned his cell phone on probably by accident, and he pinged it near Navalny's hotel. And he did the exact same thing in Tomsk by Navalny's hotel. So he made the exact same trip as Panyaev and Navalny did, going from Novosibirsk to Tomsk and then back to Moscow. And his cell phone records show that he was there. So Alexandrov and Frolov are the same person, and we know this from cross-referencing travel data and telecom data from the same person, but from their 2 different identities. So we built all this out. We just did all this crazy amount of research into all these people and all these guys. This right here, this kind of doofus looking guy with the mustache, this is Alexandrov, aka Frolov. Panyaev is in the bottom left, and there's a few other people here as well, who are the full poisoning team, who poisoned Navalny and did the cleanup operation afterwards. And we did this by looking at all their cell phone records, who they've traveled with, everything else you can imagine. And if you know this case at all, you anything about this case at all, you probably know about how Navalny called one of his poisoners. So the morning that we published this investigation, immediately before, Navalny called each of these people and tried to get them on the phone to talk to him. They all hung up on him or ignored him, except one guy, Konstantin Kudratsev, who's the second from the bottom right, the guy with the balding guy, the big forehead. He was recovering from COVID, so his mind was a little foggy at the time. And Navalny called him and pretended to be his boss. And we could pull this off easily because we knew everybody in this operation. We knew the boss of the boss of the boss. We knew everyone's names, who talked to whom, who was superior to whom. We knew this from all the phone calls and all of our spying on these people. And Navalny called Kudratsev and pretended to be the boss of his boss of his boss of his boss, taking a report about the poisoning. And he made him as a 44-minute phone call, something like that. And Navalny just bullied him. He just bullied him basically to tell him everything about this operation, trying to say like, do you really want me to talk to, Makshakov? Really want me to talk to Bogdanov? Because he knew the names of all of his bosses, and tell him and, hey, want me to call them and tell them that you didn't tell me this, and he just basically bullied this guy. And he even made him give like grades, like how would, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you grade Alexandrov? How did he do? And he'd be like, a 5, I guess, right? He would be kind of taken aback. And then Navalny would bully him like, oh, a 5? Well, why did Navalny survive then? Why did he survive? Why did the operation fail? And then you're giving everyone 5s. He just basically bullied this guy for 45 minutes. So if you haven't watched it, I recommend watching it. It's really fascinating to watch. Anyways, we all this to say, we pulled all this together from all this leaky data that we had, all the telecom data, the travel data, social media stuff, all these leaks that happened in Russia with the vehicle registrations and Yandex food and everything else, to let us be able to bully this guy and to have him tell us all the details of the operation. So we use these same techniques for all sorts of other investigations. So the things I showed you at the very beginning here with the assassination of Berlin, Skripal, the Czech arms depot explosions, we can turn all these into results, right? So we now know exactly who did the assassination of Berlin. It was an FSB hired assassin who previously did previous assassinations as well. We know about the Skripal case because of a chain of stupidity here, as The Guardian called it. The same guys who did the Salisbury poisoning also did the Czech depot explosion, which we have from telephone and travel records, putting them in the Czech Republic, or I guess Czechia, at the time of the explosion. We've heard plenty about this, about the Navalny thing, about how he duped the agent, revealing details of the operation. And I wish I had more time to talk about this, but all this also applies to how Ukraine organized this like elaborate sting operation to try to arrest a bunch of fighters from Wagner. It didn't go very well. This is a big controversy about Zelensky. He basically canceled the operation because he was trying to have peace negotiations with Russia. We saw how that went. And then Belarus caught wind of it and arrested the guys and expelled them. But so all that is to say that we can turn these different methods of operations into uncovering the secrets of intelligence operations, assassination attempts, hackings, arms depot explosions, everything else you can imagine. This is changing a little bit because the FSB and other security services in Russia have cracked down on many of these sources. You can't buy a lot of these records like you used to be able to because these data market sellers are very spooked after Navalny stuff. But there are still a lot of sources of information coming out. I mean, like I said, the Yandex food leak came out 2 weeks ago. So this stuff is still flowing out. You can still do it. It's just a little bit harder than before, but there'll always be new sources of information just because the basic infrastructure of Russian data retention and privacy is just so fundamentally broken that it's going to leak out. So because of that, there's always going to be methods of doing this. It just could maybe you have to be more creative and have a bit more willpower maybe than you would otherwise. Okay. So I'm happy to, this is the end of my slides here. I'm happy to take questions from that you may have for me.
Thank you, Eric. This is absolutely fascinating. I had a couple of questions in a way that you answered already towards the end, but let me maybe ask you to elaborate there a little bit more. So first of all, what is this about Russia that creates such a black market in this kind of telephone records in the first place? So I'm assuming they have not created that around the needs of Bellingcat and possibly related organizations. What are they? Are they spying on each other? What are they using? What are they using this for? And in light of that, so in light of the kind of normalcy background, the kind of role that this plays in Russian life, how worried? I mean, I guess you're not terribly worried about them being able to conclusively deny you access to these data. Can you just elaborate on these issues a bit?
Yeah, so it's kind of a part of a culture, that part of Russia that's been around for a while. So even back in the 90s and early 2000s, you can buy a lot of this data in like the literal like flea market, right? In the markets of, in the suburbs of Moscow, to where people sold these on, hard drives, thumb drives, CDs, things like that, of some of these leaked databases. So this is not a new thing, right? These things have existed in some level in Russia for literally for decades now, of this kind of stuff is being leaked out and published. And it's just part of the culture, and it's kind of in the back of people's minds that is a possibility, a thing that can exist, that doesn't really happen here so much. And often, a lot of times, these records are sold on the black market because people aren't being compensated very well in their normal work, right? So if you're a police officer, barely making enough money to get by, bribe, a lot of times you hear bribery. It's not as big as a problem it used to be, but bribery used to be a massive issue in Russia. This is a similar thing, a way to supplement your income, to where if you have, basically poverty wages with your actual salary as a police officer, you can supplement it by querying records, pulling them and selling them for, double your actual monthly salary for one or two personal record sales. Same things for people who work at telephone companies, banks, and things like that. So it's a lot of it is just petty corruption of people just trying to make extra money. And some of it also, as I mentioned earlier, the Yarovaya laws that were passed in 2016 that expanded the surveillance regime in Russia to require telecom companies to retain data, I think, for 6 months at a time. And this didn't exist before. So it's a combination of expanded surveillance laws, which are, I don't know if they're expansive as in the US, but they're pretty expansive. That combined with just the petty corruption and low wages and dissatisfaction a lot of people have in their normal jobs, that leads to this.
But what is typically done with these data? Is this like businessmen spying on competitors?
I guess some of that, yeah. So a lot of it is
things like that.
Yeah, a lot of it's criminals doing stuff in the black market, like identity theft. You get that a lot of times. You get things like, I guess you could say market research, right? If you're trying to competitors, right, for business people. Sometimes people use it for more like normal means, like people use it like for background checks. Like if you're going to hire somebody, you would use it like as a background check to buy someone's personal data to see like if they have like their financial data and things like that. That's kind of a substitute for what you would think about as like standard credit checks and things like that. And also you get, you hear lots of stories about, jealous wives or potentially jealous wives looking at their husband's phone records and things like that. So you get a huge range of things. And also just, you get random creeps trying to buy, some girl or whatever that they're into, and you could buy their phone records and spy on them. You get a lot of creepy stuff like that too. So it's a huge range. It's probably tends more to the gray and black than to the white, if you're talking about like on the spectrum of white market and black market uses for this. But it's also, there is a tradition in Russia of this being used for investigations. Back Novaya Gazeta, I was going to say the largest independent newspaper in Russia, but they've suspended service recently. They used a lot of this leaked travel data back in, I think, 10, 15 years ago for investigations into the assassination of Politkovskaya back when that happened, when she was murdered in her apartment building. And they used this travel data to find out some of the assassins had previously been co-travelers with some FSB officers. Some of the Chechens who did the assassinations were tied to some FSB officers. So there's a long tradition in Russia of this being used for journalistic purposes, but also a long tradition of it being abused in the black market and for snooping, I guess you could say.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Linda in the audience, and I'm going to also add on a question that I have that's connected. And, we'd like to know, what is your business model for Bellingcat and the work that you do? Who pays for this work? And my question as an add-on is really, I'd love for you to paint a picture of, are there organizations within Russia that are trying to take on this work, or is the environment there not conducive to focus on these issues, given the crack down on civil society organizations and journalists, the foreign agent law and so on. So I'd love to get a sense from you about both your work, but also the context of Russian-led efforts for accountability and transparency.
Sure. So on us first, so our budget comes, it's about one third. So about a third of our budget comes from donations. So this is like we have a Patreon, we have one-off donations people send, things like that. So about a third of it comes from that. About a third of it comes from grants from foundations or organizations. So like, large places that give grants. A lot of it is project-based funding. A little bit's unrestricted, but a lot of it's project funding. So, for example, we have a project funding from the Swedish Postcard Lottery to look at far-right extremism in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, just for example of some of our project funding we receive. And about a third of the money we get comes from private and public workshops that we run. So we run workshops that teach people how to do investigative techniques, verification, research, a lot of stuff I've been talking about here. And we charge people to do these workshops. We do some private workshops for like companies. So like if you're, a think tank, or if you're a private corporation, or if you're a nonprofit or whatever, and you want a workshop, we do it for you. And also public ones where people can apply and attend, where it's a big mix of people from all over. So that's about, our budget comes about a third from each of those sources. So give or take, 10% or so for each one. So we're kind of unique in that we have a lot of very interesting sustainable model in that we have private commercial activity with our training. We receive donations. We also have grants. So if we're not reliant on one source too much. So if we have a donor that we want to cut off from one reason or the other, we are very much able to do that because we have so many other sources coming in. If we want to reduce, if we have a big surge in work because of, for example, a war breaks out in Ukraine, we can reduce the amount of training we can do in order to focus on stuff. So that's great for us. As far as other places in Russia that are doing this, nowadays in Russia proper, no one is doing this because everyone has fled. A year or two ago, there are a lot of places doing this. These places are now mostly based abroad or kind of in flux right now. So our colleagues at the conflict intelligence team, they were a bunch of guys, mostly in Moscow and Petersburg. They have left Russia, so they are no longer in Russia, but they were literally until about a month ago, they were working out of Russia doing very similar work to what I'm talking about, that I was talking about here, but they work exclusively on conflict and war stuff, which obviously have a lot of work on their hands now. There's the guys and girls over Project, Raman Badanin, who runs their team. They just relaunched today, actually. He was, last I checked, Badanin, who heads the project of Project. He was at Palo Alto or San Francisco last I checked. I'm not sure where he is now. There's people at the Insider who do a lot of this. There are investigative partners. They were partly based in Russia, partly based abroad. Now they're pretty much all abroad. And there's a bunch of other outlets like Agentstva. Medusa does a lot of really interesting work with this. Media Zona, which does this, but a lot of open source data leak stuff, but mostly focused on police and criminal reform, things like that. But basically everywhere in Russia is now, they've either suspended their work or they're working abroad now. So there's a lot of really, really good Russian outlets, but they're not in Russia anymore, doing similar work.
So I'm next channeling another question from the audience from Bob Wyman, but let me give a little bit of context to that. So one thing about the work that you do is, it makes a lot of sense for you, so as you just did here, to actually demonstrate exactly how you come to these conclusions, right? You can't just go out there and say, we have figured out that this guy poisoned Navalny, right? So you actually have to walk people through the motions of how you have figured this out. But thereby, of course, you are also revealing your methods, not just your methods, but you are revealing things that other people also could do. And so, of course, that then leads to the worry, aren't you teaching the wrong people, ways of going about things? And in one particular group of wrong people, of course, is the Russian, these agencies themselves, right? That they, you are on top of the game. And, as always, these things go like there's a cat and mouse game going on, right? So aren't you worried that they're learning from you?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a worry about this, but a lot of these things we work with are relatively protected from that because a lot of the data sources we have are offline now and they're immune from manipulation. We have a lot of these databases that we've just scraped and we have sitting on our external hard drives and stuff. So these can't be, they can try to manipulate them, but if they try, then that that makes it even more suspicious. And a few places they've tried to do similar things. There's a few Telegram bots that let you pull and retrieve this information, and this actually worked in our favor with this, because they went and they tried to use one of these services, but a lot of these places have the same data sources. They just replicate them over and over and over and over. So maybe let's say there's 10 Telegram bots that work with basically the same information. We can look at one of these bots that are more popular that the FSB targets and tries to get information censored from. And we just look at what information they're censoring and removing, and then cross-reference that with the untampered with sources we have. And then we now know a whole bunch of new investigative leads about what they're trying to get removed and what they're trying to censor. So they've tried to do this in some cases of try to censor information and redact it and stuff from some of these sources. But the problem is, like I said, most of these databases and stuff that are out there are not like single sources, and that's all. They're replicated over lots of them. And so their efforts to censor these and tamper them down, it only helps us because it leads us to new source information. Maybe I'm revealing too much of that, but I think we've talked about this before. And these people are not terribly competent. You can see that from hopefully anything you learned from the last half hour, it's that these people aren't terribly competent at their work and very careful. And a lot of it is self-made errors. I mean, people will post on their own social media pages. People will, will register their vehicles to their work addresses. This is still happening. So a lot of this is self-inflicted, and it's just stupidity and petty corruption that is not something they can legislate or policy their way out of.
No, but you can easily see that in some office in Moscow there has been a lot of yelling by some superior officer, and a lot of and in terms of how could you be so stupid, book your flights all at the same time and use all the same pattern of camouflage names. That is,
but those bosses are doing it too. So yeah.
Okay. Sushma, back to you.
So a question from Jimmy in the audience: how do you and other investigators proactively protect yourselves from those you target in investigations?
So do you mean, so I assume he means like for us, like personally, like our own personal information. Yeah. So with this, I mean, we've had like
and your safety.
So physical safety, I mean, what am I going to do? Right. I mean, sitting in Kansas, if they want to kill me, I guess it would be a pretty brazen operation, I guess. But as far as we're much more worried about the digital side of this, obviously, because, we don't live in Ukraine, we don't live in Russia. Of people within our team. So with that, I mean, we've had cyber attacks against us and hacking attempts and phishing attempts and things like that. But for this part, I mean, you read a lot of this basic cybersecurity and resilience. So, you self-deleting chats, you use separate phone numbers for different things. You just, anything that's in a even almost public channel, like for example, like a Slack or Discord, or even if it's in a DM on Twitter, just assume that's going to be leaked at some point, right? And try to keep your communication on sensitive things to more, self-deleting channels on, more isolated phone numbers and data points. So a lot of it is relative common sense and how to handle yourself with it. And, just basically the way you operate is just assume you'll be hacked or leaked at some point with your most vulnerable points, and just try to isolate anything that's sensitive into the most, the safest or most temporary places that with self-deleting chats and, things like that. So, there's only so much you can do. I mean, there's always probably some magic, 0-day hack or something that they have. But doing the best we can at least.
Let me next channel a question from Vin Ryan. So Vin is asking, are you actually helping Ukraine at any level? The work that you are doing currently, is this going in support of the Ukrainian effort to fend off the Russian assault?
So we're not directly helping Ukraine at all, but we are doing a lot of work. I haven't talked about this stuff, but we also have a very large project working on the Justice Accountability Department of collecting, verifying, and analyzing videos showing civilian harm in Ukraine. So this is focusing on things like submunitions, attacks on hospitals, apartment buildings, schools, sensitive sites like that. And we've been collecting as much of this as we can, verifying it, documenting it, cataloging it, preserving it, archiving it, all the different verbs. And we're working with a lot of international bodies, the IC, to help their efforts as well, to give our data set to make sure they're able to use that for any future criminal cases. So we're not like directly helping, the Ukrainian government or anything like that, but we're doing more work. Eventually they may use this data in any human rights cases against Russia, after the war's over. that'd be great, I guess. But right now, we're not directly helping the government as much as we're doing this big data set for future international criminal work, and also for historical purposes too. Just because future historians, who want to understand the war and how it happened, will hopefully have this data set they can work with.
Yeah, I guess that connects to a question I have more broadly about this type of work, and whether does it actually lead to accountability, and does it change future practices and protect human rights in the future, or is it really sort of trying to catch up with abuses once they've occurred?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know, but preventative, I mean, I don't know how you would quantify that, because I don't know, like, for example, like, let's say we publish an article about these poisoning guys, Navalny, right? Well, we burned all of them, right? We put all their names and information and stuff out there. So I don't know how many people the FSB has. Like, I don't know how deep their bench is. I don't know if they have 50 more people who could step up and do their work immediately, or if these were their top of their top guys and they don't have anyone else who could do this. And so they have to spend 2 years to train them before they can do a new poisoning operation. Right? I have no idea. So it's possible that maybe we're burning through their officers to where it reduces their capabilities of doing more operations, in which case, maybe we prevented something, right? Or maybe, they aren't very careful in the first place. Maybe they don't care so much about it. They have the best, most elite people, and they're just sending, the dummies out there to do the stuff, which I guess is what they were doing anyways. So again, I can't quantify and say if we've slowed down or stopped any operations from the security services. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. I don't really know. But with some of our other work, yeah, it has led to pretty direct results. Most notably, the Berlin case of the guy named Vadim Kresikov, who assassinated a Chechen man in broad daylight in Berlin. Our work was used very, 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 very heavily by the German court, and he was prosecuted. He was named under his real name, not his fake identity, but under his actual real identity that we discovered. He was named as working with the FSB in Russia, and he was charged with murder and all that stuff off the back of the work that we did. So that led to a pretty direct result there in the German courts using our evidence and our data that we collected. And a lot of the work we've done on MH17 has been cited and used on the ongoing case. That hopefully the trial will end one day, but it's been going on forever now. It's 8 years, since almost 8 years now. And a lot of our work has been cited directly by the joint investigation team that's looking into the criminal downing. So again, maybe it's preventative, I'm not sure, but we do have a handful of specific cases of our work being used in actual proceedings too after our publication.
Thank you. There's a few questions in the audience that would like to know a little bit more about how Bellingcat is operating as an organization, and this is also something I'm myself curious about. So can you just elaborate a little bit on how many of you are there? How are you? How I know you are also engaged with you personally are engaged with outreach and education programs. How are you trying to make and to leave an imprint on the world? Maybe that's a way of capturing the whole field of. Yeah.
So we have about 30 paid staff on board now. I was the first hired, Elliot's founder. I was the first hired employee back in November 2015. So we've grown pretty quickly. And we have different kind of different shells of, or different, levels of work. So we have 30 or so paid staff, but we also have contributors who send in articles once in a while that we publish. These are kind of standard contributors, as you would see on any news website or analytic website. We also have groups of volunteers. We have the Global Authentication Project, which is our volunteer program. We run that off of a Discord with our volunteer. We have 2 volunteer coordinators who work with us. Charlotte heads it up on our team. And we also have a larger Discord with 1,000 or 2 people in there, where people kind of work and kind of chat about general topics. So for example, we were talking yesterday about trying to geolocate and try to locate some footage of Kadyrov, who was going all over Russia. He claimed to be in Ukraine, but probably wasn't, in a hospital and elsewhere. So, that's kind of a little lighter stuff, I guess you could say, that goes on in there. So yeah, we have kind of different, like I said, different levels of the core paid staff. And then within our team, we have, our tech team who focus on tech capabilities. We have, our logistics, admin people, fundraising, development, all that. And then we have teams who work on different topics around like I obviously do stuff in Russia, Ukraine. We have people who work on environmental topics, corruption, so on and so forth. We're still relatively small compared to like, Human Rights Watch or Amnesty and those, gigantic places. But we feel like we're really big now because we used to be, like a dozen paid staff for years, and now we've, doubled, tripled our size. But we also still really engage with a lot of volunteers and contributors who are outside of our immediate staff. Just it's what we've always done, and we still are.
But that's actually, it's interesting that you make this comparison to Human Rights Watch, because in a way there's the kernel of a very ambitious projection into the future there, right? Because you could say Human Rights Watch in a way is the analog version, of an earlier stage, right? I mean, they're watching things, right? They're writing reports,
yeah, sure.
they're keeping records, and they're making sure that people have the requisite knowledge to actually assess the human rights situation. And so what you just said basically invites us to think of Bellingcat as the digital version of Human Rights Watch. Is this the kind of ambition that you have? So I mean, I can totally see that there is the sky is the limit, right? To this kind of work, given how much we do digitally.
Yeah, maybe. I think we're also hesitant about expanding too much. I don't think that we want to grow for the sake of growing. I mean, I think that our ideal size would be something a little maybe close to what we are already. So I don't think that we have ambitions to grow to be to have offices all over and, have our CEO make $1 million and all that stuff. I don't think we want to go that way. I think we'd rather stay relatively small, like, and cap out at 40, 50 people at most, right? And see a little bit smaller. But but we're doing some fun kind of side stuff. Well, maybe this will be the main thing, not the side thing. But we are doing a lot of work with media projects with the production company. We helped with the Navalny documentary that is coming out. It's already out. It won a bunch of things at Sundance, and it's gonna, in the US, it's screening on April 11th and 12th. At like 800 theaters. I'm in Kansas City, and there's 5 theaters within 5 miles of me showing it. So if you're in the US, you can definitely see it nearby. And we have a bunch of other projects in the work with different documentaries and stuff like that too. So we're trying to, we don't want to become a gigantic corporation, I guess, a corporate nonprofit or whatever you want to call it. But we are trying to do kind of grow in smart ways and not just grow for the sake of growth, which is something we definitely don't want to, we don't want to get we don't want to become unwieldily large, whatever the adverb is for that. So it'd be nice. Human Rights Watch, obviously, and Amnesty, they do a lot of great work, but I don't think we want to be even half the size that they are, probably.
So Mathias raised a really interesting question, and I'd like to ask my final question and connect back to what I asked earlier about funding. And I'm wondering if you take any government funding, and if you have policies around that, and who do you see Bellingcat as accountable to? Who does your board represent and your staff? I'm just curious about this, given how increasingly countries around the world are scrutinizing the work of journalists, human rights defenders, anti-corruption activists, people who are trying to hold governments accountable. So how do you place yourself within this accountability landscape?
Sure. Yeah. So we have some EU funding. We don't have direct government funding. We have some EU funding with some projects based on, I think, studying like QAnon and like it often like the Swedish postcode lottery, which is like kind of like half government, half not, that looks at far right stuff. We had a grant with NED that's expiring soon that works on training Russian language. Basically, our trainings that we already run for people that people pay for, we basically give these trainings for free in Russian to Russian language journalists in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Russia. I think that grant's going to expire just because we can't do it in-person trainings anymore because of COVID. So basically, that grant was funding us to be able to run workshops in like Tbilisi and Yerevan and Almaty and places like that. We can't really do that anymore. So that funding, I think we're going to let that expire. But yeah, so we don't take direct NED and EU are like kind of indirect funding, I guess you could say, government funding, but it's close. But those are, it definitely doesn't, direct our editorial line or anything like that. It's very utilitarian of, providing training to people who couldn't afford it otherwise. And as far as who are accountable, I mean, yeah, I think that it's obviously our private and public donors of, individual who donate to us expecting, X, Y, and Z. We don't shift our editorial lines based on any of this. We get yelled at a lot because we focus on topics people don't like a lot. We did a lot of work on the far right in Ukraine that people did not like at all, but I think was still really good and important and still holds up to scrutiny if you were to research it and look at it again. Yeah, I know it's a lot, but we, like with everybody else, a lot of the work we do is also driven. And I don't know, try to how to say this. It's the interest we receive from funders and potential funders and donors is often reflected in this. So we had a huge project we worked on Yemen. We had a yemen.bellingcat.com. You can go there still. We spent we put a ton of our unrestricted funding into this. I think we spent $200,000 of our own unrestricted funding into making a big project, basically what we're doing with Ukraine now, of collecting evidence of human rights abuses in Yemen, of the Saudi-led coalition, and all the horrible stuff, the famine, everything that's going on there. We hired people for it. We had this huge dedicated effort for it. And we were expecting that all this would then turn into funding and grants and all that stuff, but there was no interest. We applied, we asked, no one wanted to fund it at all. And it just kind of withered away because we put a ton of money and effort into this and it just kind of didn't happen, which is sad. And now with Ukraine, we have an overwhelming amount of interest in this. So it's kind of sad. That's kind of how things are, because we tried to put as much effort into Yemen as we are into Ukraine, but there wasn't any interest from funders. And so we couldn't sustain it. We tried our best and we still are doing work on it, but it just, if you can't pay people, then you can't pay for the work. But with Ukraine, there's an overwhelming amount of interest and stuff on it, which, it obviously deserves attention and stuff, but it's a little disheartening just that the huge gap in attention that people and that funders had for Yemen, which is, the most horrible things you'll ever see going on there still, and Ukraine, which is still obviously quite horrible too. But yeah, so that's just maybe not exactly to what your question was, but just kind of a reality of this situation too that maybe want to highlight. And if any funders want to fund any Yemen work, maybe this is a little shout out that we would love to do that still, if anyone actually wanted to fund it. Yeah.
You raised a really interesting point about, how to manage sort of the growing demands around the world with the ways in which donors and governments and those in power shape particular agendas. Thank you so much for joining us today, Eric, and thank you for your work.
Absolutely. Thanks. So sorry I went a little bit long, but thanks for having me on.